Hello, this is the India Research Center podcast. Today I have with me to discuss the relationship between India and South Africa, Professor Anil Sooklal, the High Commissioner of South Africa to the Republic of India. He's a person of Indian origin, a distinguished academician, and a great scholar. Thank you, Professor Sooklal, for joining me for this particular podcast.
Thank you very much for having us.
Professor, I want to start this podcast by asking you a bit about your ancestry, about the Indian African community, Indian South African community. You have been speaking in your past lectures and you have been writing about the Indian African community, their struggle, and also their migration, the waves of migration that took place, their struggle in South Africa. So I want to know first about the community and also about you in particular and your family.
No, thank you. Firstly, let me express our deep gratitude to this India Research Center for hosting us in this beautiful historic city of Gwalior, in the fort and palace here that we've been so impressed by, and especially the contribution of this India family to India's development, especially in the field of education. It's really remarkable. I think it's important to understand that India and South Africa have a very, very, very unique relationship. And I cannot think of many countries in the world that are wedded by a common history, the shared history that India and South Africa have. Of course, in more recent times, this is based on the large Indian community that you have in South Africa. But what is the history of this? And it goes back to our common period of being under British colonial rule. Both South Africa and India were part of that empire. And one of the things, of course, the British did was to fully exploit the resources of our countries, including the human resources, for developing the empire. And in the case of India was a very important, well, it is referred to as the crown jewel of the British Empire. But it was a very important source of human resource, not just military during the World Wars where Indian soldiers were involved, but also in terms of expertise, where Indians were shipped to all parts of the empire for their respective expertise, whether it was railway building, whether it was agriculture and other fields. So, as you know, in 1834, the system of slavery was abolished by the British, coming under intense global pressure for the inhumane treatment of the African slaves. And of course, this was a major setback for the British because slavery provided a very important source of cheap, free labor in many senses. And they had to find a new source to replenish this loss. And what did they do? They turned to India. They turned to India, especially for laborers from India to work in the agricultural sphere in various parts of the empire. So in the very same year, 1834, the system of indentured laborers started, where thousands of Indians were shipped from various parts of India, mainly in the north from the port of Calcutta and the south, port of Madras then, firstly to Mauritius. Excuse me. As you know, Mauritius was a sugar country. Sugar was the mainstay of its economy. And of course, India had a major sugar industry and much expertise in sugar farming. So they took Indian laborers to go and work in Mauritius to develop the agricultural sector, sugar specifically. And it worked very well because immediately there was an upward swing in terms of the Mauritian economy as a result of the high yields based on the expertise that the Indian indentured laborers brought to them. So then they started replicating this to other parts of the empires, especially countries that had major sugar plantations. So you saw that in 1838, Trinidad, followed by Guyana, all of the Caribbean islands, Suriname, you had movement of indentured Indians to go and work in these countries. And the same with South Africa. In 1860, they started this process because South Africa also was a major sugar producing country. But the crop production was very low, and the local communities were not very keen on working in these plantations. So they sent people from India to go and work on the sugar plantations. So between the period 1860 to 1911, 152,000 Indians were transported to South Africa as indentured laborers. So my history is tied up with that movement of Indians from the motherland to South Africa. So towards the end of 1892, my great-grandparents went to South Africa, aboard one of the ships, and landed there in 1893, beginning, and were signed to work at a sugar plantation in the province. I come from KwaZulu-Natal, in the south coast of that province, Burnside, to work in the sugar farms there. So my great-grandfather was 30 years old, together with my great-granny, and the 3 children. My grandfather was then 6 years old, and his 2 sisters, 4 and 2. They went to South Africa to work as laborers there. So that's my history. And of course, as you know, these indentured laborers were tied to an agreement, a 5-year agreement to work on these plantations. After that tenure of 5 years, they had the choice of remaining in South Africa, and where they were given a piece of land equivalent, monetary value equivalent to the cost of a return fare to India. And the majority decided to stay in South Africa, because after 5 years you assimilate, and your life is centered around your adopted country. And that's the beginning of the Indian community, which now numbers about 1.8 million. The largest, it's about half of the Indian African diaspora in the African continent, about 3.5 million Indians on the African continent. Half of that is in South Africa, and the major part of them, about 60% plus, is in Greater Durban, our hometown. But of course, what you saw is Indians are very resilient, creative, and can deal with adversity. Most of them, in a very short period, became independent farmers. My grandfather became a farmer, and he started growing various crops, like rice. At that stage, we grew rice in South Africa, even though we don't now, but he was growing rice and other fruits and vegetables, and he started building wealth as a self-made businessman. And he became very wealthy just within one generation. He bought large tracts of land, and he was one of the first Indian South African to start a private bus company. So he bought buses when I was a child. I remember playing with these buses because we owned those buses then. And so did many others, venture into various other small businesses and became very prosperous. Well, others went into various other forms of vocation. So I think I come from a good pedigree in the sense that my great-grandfather went there penniless and as a laborer, but by the time my grandfather came on the scene, he was a prosperous business person. The same with my nana from my mother's side. Also went my great-grandfather from my mother's side also went there as laborers. But my grandfather became a major businessman, highly respected in Durban, and quite diversified. He owned shops selling clothing and groceries like dal and rice and all of these things. Very prosperous. And he also had fun. I remember as children, we should go on holiday to my nana's house, and he'd have a vast plantation of bananas. We should call it Nana Banana. Because he should cut the bananas and bring it, put it on the roadside, and we had to stand there and sell it. Or he would grow vegetables, green beans, peas, peanuts. And when we go for holiday, he should make us work on the farm. And for us it was exciting because we should then cut the beans and everything and take it to the morning market and go and sell it in the market. It shows just how resilient they were. And this is the resilience, I think, of the Indian community, not just in South Africa, I think wherever they went, as ordinary laborers. But today they've picked themselves up. You would have seen in countries like Mauritius, South Africa included, Indians that came from this humble background rose to become heads of state in the case of Mauritius, Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, in the case of South Africa when we became a democracy. Many people of Indian origin were full cabinet ministers. Others were holding very high positions in not only state missionary agencies, but prominent business people in society. And I think that's, also the strength that you see about how creative Indians are, wherever you may take them and transplant them. They make sure, they're very hardworking, very resilient, and lift up the life of all, not just their families, but very strong sense of community. So that's one dimension which relates to my ancestry. But South Africa is also unique in the sense that we had a second dimension that brought us in close association in our shared history with India. As you know, Mahatma Gandhi went to South Africa in 1893, the very year that my grandfather arrived there, to go and represent an Indian merchant in South Africa, a person of Indian origin that was doing business there and got involved in a trade dispute, and he needed legal representation. Of course, they didn't have Indian lawyers. As an indentured community, they needed professional services, so he asked Gandhi to come and represent him. So Gandhi went there in his capacity as a lawyer, very young Gandhi, about 24 years old when he arrived in South Africa, just started his legal practice in India, that was about a year old. But of course he was to stay there for 21 years. And Gandhi was deeply, deeply impacted by what he witnessed in South Africa. He had no exposure to racial discrimination, the abuse of fellow humans by the colonial masters of that time, and privileges based on the color of your skin. And this all left a lasting impact on Gandhi. It started from the very beginning to get Gandhi to question his own philosophy of life. And what you saw in this 21 years is a total transformation of Gandhi. Gandhi went there, dressed up British way, nice suit, tie, very immaculate. By the time he left South Africa in 1914, he was wearing a dhoti, very simple. And that was not just a physical transformation. What you saw on the outside from the suit to the dhoti symbolized a greater transformation that had taken place within the psyche and person of Gandhi. Based on what he experienced and the hardship that he himself, Gandhi was beaten many times, even put in prison in South Africa. In fact, one of the prisons that Gandhi served in, Mandela was also put in the same prison by the apartheid regime. So, as much as Gandhi was transformed by South Africa equally was impacted by Gandhi and transformed by Gandhi. Because one of the first things that Gandhi did when he saw how the Indians were being treated and abused by the colonial powers, he realized the need to organize themselves into a powerful political entity to agitate for their rights. So he established the first political party, not just in South Africa. It was the first organized political party on the African continent, the Natal Indian Congress. Natal is the province where we were in. And of course, it was influenced by the Indian National Congress. He used the same structures to create a political party there. And that became a major influence in agitating for the rights of the Indians. And later on, he was to establish a second branch of that political party in our neighboring province, where Johannesburg is housed, the Transvaal Indian Congress. So these two Indian congresses were the forerunners of what later was to become the South African Indian Congress, which was then to form an alliance with the African National Congress of Mandela and to work collectively for the liberation of South Africa. And the roots of this is Gandhi Italian Congress. So you can see the link between India and South Africa in terms of our own struggle. But of course, Gandhi's experiment with truth took place in South Africa, as his book by the same name very details very much the transformation that took place. His first ashram, the idea of having a collective community, was established in Durban, in a place called Phoenix Settlement it is. It's still a heritage site in South Africa, and later on he was to establish a second ashram called Tolstoy Farm because of the friendship he had with Leo Tolstoy. So it's not when he came, I think in 1916, and established Sabarmati as the first ashram. It wasn't his first. His first is in South Africa, and he used the same model to create the ashram in Sabarmati. But it was during this time, and Gandhi was very involved in working with all the race groups during the Anglo-Boer War and during the, what they call the Bambata Rebellion or the Zulu Rebellion. The Anglo-Zulu War took place. Gandhi immediately went and created the Peace Corps to assist the wounded. And that again showed the humanitarian nature of Gandhi, to want and go and assist fellow human beings in suffering. and the contribution he's made is widely recorded in both these wars. And it was all of these experiences that led Gandhi to create his and evolve his philosophy of ahimsa. Having experienced firsthand the abuse through racial laws of one human being against the other, the harsh laws that existed, that discriminated against the Indians and the Africans, having experienced war firsthand in both these wars that I referred to, where he was part of the Peace Corps, the pain and suffering, and the abuse of the environment. Because as much as from the very beginning, Gandhi was an environmentalist, very conscious of the damage we are doing also to Mother Earth. And it was this that led him to develop his philosophy of non-violence, ahimsa, and satyagraha, passive resistance, which was to have an impact not only on South Africa's liberation struggle, but India's liberation struggle, and also Martin Luther King in the American Civil Rights Movement, directly impacted by Gandhi's philosophy. So that's the historical linkages between our two countries. Now the third dimension, of course, is the role that India played in championing South Africa's liberation struggle. Of course, in order for South Africa to gain its liberation and freedom, we could not have done it by ourselves. We needed support from the international community. The world needed to know what was happening in South Africa. We were not living in the technological age then. News about what was happening in South Africa didn't percolate to all parts of the world. So it was India, as early as 1946, decided to impose economic sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa, which was a major shock to the apartheid regime. How dare this country take such drastic action. But it immediately brought global attention to one sovereign country highlighting the pain and suffering of a country where the people, the majority, are being abused. So in 1946, economic sanctions, and when India became independent, you then extended this to comprehensive sanctions, the total isolation of South Africa, political sanctions, economic, cultural sanctions. But you were also the first country to take this issue of apartheid to the United Nations and put it on the international agenda. And of course, that had a rolling effect, because now all countries could see what was happening on the South African struggle for freedom, and just how repressive this regime was, and the abuse of fellow human beings. And of course, later on, this was to extend to sporting sanctions. India was at the forefront to have South Africa suspended from the ICC. So the total isolation, and of course, once sanctions started, many countries started doing that. And this was a major factor in isolating South Africa, and finally got the apartheid regime on its knees, a very weakened regime that realized that the only way for the future of the country is to talk with the so-called enemy. The liberation movements led by Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress. And that international pressure, India had a major anti-apartheid groups throughout India who spoke and championed at every occasion. I don't think there was any occasion where all of the leaders of India, your presidents, prime ministers, when they were in international platforms, be it at NAM, the United Nations, G77, or any multilateral meeting, where they would not raise the plight of the South Africans and what apartheid South Africa was doing. And this, of course, India was at the forefront of. So naturally, when eventually Mandela was released from prison in 1995, one of the first countries he visited in that very year, he came to India to thank the government and people of India for the major role that you played in our freedom struggle. And also our readmittance into the international cricket world was facilitated by India. In fact, it's the Scindia family who was, I think,
Mark Ross, then president of the
BCCI. President of BCCI, that started the whole process to get South Africa readmitted. And that is why the first cricket match, test match that South Africa played on its readmittance in 1992, the team came and they even played a match here.
Yes.
Again, to thank India and the BCCI for the important role they played, because sporting sanctions also hurt the apartheid regime, it isolated them. And of course, this is the history that we enjoy. As you can see, there's various phases to it. And naturally, in 1994, following our elections, India was one of the first countries to establish embassies. We did so here in Delhi and a consulate in Mumbai. India established its embassy in Pretoria, consulate in Durban, Johannesburg, Cape Town. So very vibrant bilateral relationship. In fact, next year is a very important year. Next year will mark the 30th anniversary of what we call the Red Fort Declaration.
Yes.
In 1997,
March 1997.
Yes, President Mandela came here and he signed what we refer to now as the Strategic Partnership, and what is called the Red Fort Declaration. So next year will mark the 30th anniversary of that very important development in our relations. Our relations has grown substantially, continues to grow on every front. It's not just government front, in the bilateral level. We've signed so many MOUs on a whole range, you name it, we've got MOUs between our countries, regular ministerial meetings, we've had state visits on both sides. All of your prime ministers, your president, even Abdul Kalam, went to to South Africa on a state visit, and we've had all of our presidents, starting from Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, Cyril Ramaphosa, all have come here on state visits. And I've been fortunate to accompany 3 of them. I came with Mbeki during state visit with Zuma, and Ramaphosa, who was your chief guest in January 2019 on your Republic Day. He was the chief guest, as was Nelson Mandela in 1995, your chief guest at your Republic Day. So very vibrant, not just, as I said, on the bilateral front, multilateral front. We are members of BRICS, leading members of BRICS. We are members of the G20. We work together under the trilateral format, IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indian Ocean Rim Association, which was started here based on the visit in 1995 when President Mandela came. And he put out the idea that we, as the littoral states of the Indian Ocean, we should create our own community because it's our ocean. And we should give shape to this ocean. So that's how the Indian Ocean Rim Association was started in 1997 with its secretariat based in Mauritius. And this year you also chair the Indian Ocean Rim Association, a very important year for you. And the current Secretary General of the IORA Secretariat is from India. You chair BRICS this year for the 4th time. So a very important year for India leading major global south bodies like BRICS and IORA. And of course, you're going to have the India-Africa Summit.
Indeed, excellent.
So on the multilateral front, we have very strong cooperation. And then the business sector, very vibrant. We account for almost 20% of India's total trade with Africa. Over 150 plus Indian companies, about 30 or so South African companies. And the numbers grow. In the short period I've been here, there's so many new companies that have gone and opened up offices in South Africa. Many South African companies coming to India.
After all, South Africa is the biggest economy of the African continent. Yes. India happens to be the 4th largest economy in the world.
Absolutely. You are our 4th largest trading partner globally, and we are India's largest trading partner on the African continent. But equally important is the people-to-people interaction. We have a vibrant exchange between our countries. So we have MOUs on the education front, cultural front, sporting front. When our cricket teams play, it's fireworks, right? And both are cricket-loving countries. Many South African names are household names in India in the cricket arena. Likewise, Indian cricketers are a household name in South Africa. The IPL, a number of our cricketers are here, and the South Africa T20. All the 5 franchises are owned by Indian IPL. And of course, culturally, with the large Indian community, there's a very vibrant exchange between ourselves, language, religion, art, dance, music, food. All of this binds our people. Very vibrant interaction. Both sides. Tourism. We're seeing increasing number of tourists from India to South Africa. Increasing loads. South Africans love coming to India. We're hopeful that there'll be a direct flight during the course of this year. We don't have it. We had it pre-COVID. But I'm confident that 3 airlines, South African Airways, Air India, and Indigo, are quite advanced.
If I'm not wrong, Excellency, at the moment, Ethiopian Airways is playing a good role.
Ethiopia serves, many South Africans use that route from Mumbai, Delhi to Addis to South Africa. But I'm confident there'll be a direct flight this year between Johannesburg and Mumbai as a start.
We hope so too, Excellency.
It will happen, and I can tell you that's going to be a major boost, not just for tourism, but also for business. I think that will accelerate.
Excellency, my next question to you is this: that like you mentioned, in a wonderful way, you narrated about the relationship, the strong relationship that India and South Africa have. India has recognized great South African leaders like Nelson Mandela. He was awarded the Bharat Ratna, and you yourself, you were awarded the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman by the government of India for your excellence in the field of diplomacy and taking the flag of India and the Indian values in the global sphere. Excellency, you come, like you mentioned about the past of the Girmitiya community. There have been many leaders from this particular community that have excelled in the world. I would like to ask you, who is that one Girmitiya leader from this community that has inspired you the most?
Well, I was very fortunate in 1989 when we were still under apartheid rule and very isolated. The first global conference, GOPIA, of people of Indian origin took place in New York. And because I had been doing work, and by that stage I was an academic on the Girmitiya community, I was invited. I was the only South African invited to that conference. And for the first time, I was exposed to the Indian diaspora. And there were two. You asked for one, but I actually have to cite two Girmitiyas that I met there, who I was deeply impressed by. One was Chedi Jagan from Guyana, who was later to become president, and the other was Pastor Pandey from Trinidad. Of course, Chedi Jagan was in exile then because Guyana was having its own challenges, and especially the Indian origin Guyanese. And of course, within Trinidad itself, there was challenges there. But the leadership and the balance of views, no bitterness, that they displayed in all the interactions during that conference, and I had a chance also to interact with them because I had some friends from Trinidad and I stayed with them actually for that period in New York at their homes. They were the true leaders that left an indelible mark on me and impacted on me in terms of our struggle, because we were still under apartheid. And I realized that we are not alone in this struggle. Here you have other Girmitiya community leaders that have been marginalized, abused, and kicked out from the countries based on the skin color and the prejudice against the Indian origin. So if I have to look back at Girmitiya leaders and the impact that meeting had on me and how it also influenced what I took back to South Africa, I'll say those were the two Girmitiya leaders, and I was very pleased later on to see Chedi Jagan become president of Guyana and Pastor Pandey, Prime Minister of Trinidad. And I had the occasion a few years later to visit both those countries when my wife and I were doing comparative studies of Indians in Trinidad, Mauritius, and in South Africa. I visited Guyana and I visited Trinidad, and I was very pleased to see that those countries were back on the upward trajectory. Yes, I would say those were the two.
Great to hear that, Excellency. Excellency, you are a diplomat, apart from being an academician. And in today's day and age, we see this so-called, this thing is coming up, a crisis of multilateralism. And the world is becoming increasingly unipolar. In this kind of a scenario, what role do you see of, countries of the global south, particularly India and South Africa? What do you think we should do, and what should be the strategy that we should adopt?
Well, I must say, as you rightfully put it, increasingly the world is becoming more unilateral. We've seen that in recent days. But it's been a move that has been there for a number of years. It's not an overnight development. The erosion of multilateralism has been taking place for almost 2 decades. Most sharply came to the forefront with the invasion of Afghanistan following 9/11 and subsequently Iraq and then Libya by major powers that had no mandate from the United Nations. But what we are seeing also is, and in many senses I think one would expect this, we are seeing a total reorientation of the global high table. the global high table was sitting very comfortably for over a century, since the Industrial Revolution, with chairs only for the developed world, the major economies. That is why they created a special club for themselves in 1975, the G7, the so-called most powerful economies, that they only could find solutions to the global economic crisis that emanated following the Gulf crisis, and where oil came to the forefront for the first time as a major global commodity and a major global political instrument. And the G7, and for a short period, you had G8 when Russia joined in the 90s until 2014 when they were again removed, became the global agenda setting body, and in many senses started undermining the mandate of the United Nations. Global agenda setting, be it on the global political security front, on the economic financial front, on the social front, was all determined when the G7 got together. It was as if they were the overlords of the world. And we from the global south were bystanders to this process and almost helpless to do anything about it. Because if decisions were taken at the G7, they were implemented within the UN systems. So what we saw is the need for the global south to also start taking collective action in terms of determining their own fate. Of course, we had bodies like the non-aligned movement, the G77. But by the turn of the millennium, these bodies had run its course in terms of what the real mandate was. It still exists today, but it doesn't have that punch that it had in the early period when it was created to assist with the decolonization process, with addressing the challenges in terms of the global economy and the place of the global south in that. So it was natural, I think, to see that the global south was never forever going to remain poor. And as I keep reminding ourselves, up to about 1810, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, for almost 2,000 years, the global economy was dominated by two countries, two major global powers, India and China. And not many people talk about this today. India accounted for almost 26% of global GDP before the British came and went right with the Indian economy and the country as a whole. And by the time they left in 1947, that had dropped to about 2%. Same happened with China. So what you are seeing, history move in cycles. You had major empires, the Greco-Roman empires at some stage, the Egyptian pharaonic empires, the Mesopotamians, all of these Assyrians, the Persians, past major empires that dominated the civilizational space. But they are all in history books today. It's China and India where you have continuity. And what you are seeing with the rise of both India and China and other powers of the global south is the natural movement of history in the cycle that it moves. This whole industrial revolution and the global not domination is an aberration in human history. So what you started seeing from the 90s onwards with the opening up of China and then shopping, 1978, the reforms in India and Narasimha Rao in 1991, the changes that took place in post-Soviet Union, the Russian Federation. They went through a difficult time under Boris Yeltsin, but when Putin came to power about 2.5 decades ago, he steadied Russia and got it back onto a growth trajectory. The last of the African state was emancipated from apartheid in 1994. The African Organization of African Unity that was formed in 63 could now transform and focus its attention away from fighting for the independence and sovereignty of African states to the economic and developmental challenges of the African community. And that's why in 2002, the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, transformed into the African Union. At a summit in Durban, July 2002, I was present there. And now the whole focus of the AU is the evolved Agenda 2063. In 2013, that was launched, a blueprint for Africa's development. But even before that, you had the NEPAD, New Partnership for Africa's Development, which was an economic blueprint developed by Africans, for Africans.
There's some similarities with the Viksit Bharat 2047.
Very much. Viksit Bharat 2047 and Agenda 2063 have many synergies, So you see the transformation that was taking part in the Global South. In fact, way back in 1998, there was a World Bank report alluding to what was happening in the Global South and the rapid rise of countries like India, China, Indonesia, Brazil. Brazil also went through a difficult phase under military rule during the 70s, 80s, and then President Cardoso came and stabilized the ship, and Brazil started moving in a positive direction. So you saw all of these countries that are part of the BRICS architecture. A vibrancy started emerging, and global growth was now being the chief engine of global growth, started shifting from the north to the south. And by the turn of the millennium, your fastest growing economies was from the global south. And following the global economic crisis, which was created in Europe and the USA, when your major banking institutions started failing, that demonstrated how fragile the global north was. And this is why they decided to elevate the G20, which was just a finance minister track, in 2008 to a summit level meeting. And for the first time, the global north recognized that in order to address the fault lines in the global financial economic architecture, no longer can we do it as a G7. We have to do it as a collective, because there are powerful countries from the global south whose economies are bigger than G7 economies. And I think what you are seeing now is a passing of the baton from the global north to the south. But it's not a voluntary passing. It's a resistance.
Excellency, in the global south, there's this debate going on. And it's been going on for a long time between the realist school of thought and the idealistic school of thought. And on the one hand, you have globally thinkers like, when we talk about realism, like Sun Tzu, like Chanakya, like Machiavelli, and you have in diplomacy Henry Kissinger, statesmen like Margaret Thatcher, where use of hard power is focused on. On the other hand, you have thinkers like Nelson Mandela, who focused on dialogue and diplomacy and peaceful coexistence, and was very idealistic and sanguine about the fact that the world people can live together. I mean, something that India has been talking about, that word is one family, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So he was very sanguine about that. How do you see, what kind of future do you see of these kind of idealistic ideologies in the global south when there's so much pressure coming from the so-called West or the global north?
I think there has to be a marriage of both. They both can't exist as separate streams. In the current environment we live in, we can't chuck out the idealism of our leaders that envisaged a global society living in harmony and inclusive society. That's still the ideal we want. But there's certain realities on the ground, as you pointed out today. We live in a world where the multilateral system has been weakened, where I have said that for now, we caught up again in a unipolar moment. But what we are seeing is the pillars of a multipolar world have already been erected. Multipolarism, and you'll see this in BRICS Summit declarations, including the past two, We refer to a multipolar world because we're entering and we're in a multipolar world as well. Power is no longer centered around one country, one region. There are various other centers of powers today, and that's the reality. And therefore, we should not lose sight of the ideals in terms of what we want for a future global system. That should still be our guiding principles. But we have to be realistic as well to address the current challenges that we find ourselves in. And we have to do so from a position of power. And I keep saying the global south is no longer powerless. The global south is very powerful. And BRICS as one entity demonstrate how powerful we are as a collective. Of course, it's an evolving architecture in terms of the global south working together for our collective interest. But you needed a catalyst and an instrument to lead this process. And therefore, a body like BRICS becomes very critical. And I believe India, having the presidency this year, has it as a very critical moment. Because we need to continually work towards a global order, a multipolar order. The global system has to be underpinned by international law. It has to be underpinned by the Charter of the United Nations. The UN, with all its weaknesses and faults, is still our global body that binds us together under one umbrella. And we have to constantly speak out and act against unilateral measures, unilateral actions, and countries that constantly undermine international law and the UN Charter.
Excellent. See, now before I end the podcast, I would like to shift my questions from directed to Excellency Sooklal, the diplomat, to Professor Sooklal, Oriental historian and an expert of religious sciences. First, I would like to ask you, Professor, that Africa as a continent has had a great past. I mean, from the Zulus of South Africa to the great Zimbabwe, to the Empire of Kush, to the Malis, Mansa Musa of Mali, to the North African empires, to the Amazigh in the north, the Berbers, to the maritime traditions of Tanzania and other places. It has been a rich continent, cradle of civilization. So, in today's day and age, what do you think in India particularly we should do to promote the knowledge of Africa, the history of Africa, the knowledge systems of Africa? What is your opinion about this?
Well, one of the things I've always said is we as Africans and India, we think we know each other because of this long history we have of contact and interface and exchange between ourselves over centuries. But increasingly, when I go and speak at universities, not very long ago, I was at one of the universities, and when I went to the podium, I started a question. The question I asked is, how many of you know that Gandhi lived in South Africa for 21 years? I think no one put up their hands. Then I asked them, how many years did Mandela spend in prison? Someone said 6 years. That's the answer I got. So I think what we need to do, and this can't come from government alone, I think our institutions, our universities, our schools, our think tanks, our various cultural bodies, religious bodies, sporting bodies, we need more exchange between our peoples of Africa and India to better understand each other. Many, not just in India, even when I was serving as ambassador to the European Union, when you say you're from South Africa, they think Africa is one country. Many still think we have lions and elephants roaming our streets. That's the antiquated perceptions that you have of the continent.
Like the same charm of India.
Like the same charm of India. But I think it is changing, and it's changing quite fast. That's why I was so pleased I had the opportunity to go and speak to students. Very often I go to universities, but equally important is to visit schools and to go to this India school and this India Kanya Vidyalaya yesterday, for me was most fulfilling. And if we can start sowing these seeds in the minds of our students, that they better understand our history and our respective cultures and civilizations and how closely we work with each other. And I think India has an important year in terms of relations with Africa. You will host the 4th India-Africa Summit during the course of this year. And that's an opportunity where one of the pillars, and this is something your Prime Minister has repeatedly spoken about, is to strengthen people-to-people interaction, strengthen student exchanges, university exchanges, scholarships. So I think we need to put more energy into that. Because today we're fortunate, the world is a little village. And increasingly, we get exposure through media, through technology of countries around the world, even if we cannot travel there. So I think we need more and more of these, starting at school level, in terms of the rich history that Africa and India shares.
Excellency, that when you are in a city of Gwalior, you have visited the hill of Gopachur, which is so important for particularly 3 Indic religions of Jainism, Hinduism, and Sikhism. What role do you see of India as a civilizational state? We talk about the idea of the Vishwaguru. We talk also about the idea of Vishwabandhu, the friend of the world. So, what role do you see of India? As you rightly said, there is a crisis of multilateralism and there are multiple things, transition taking place in the global world. What role do you see of India in this particular scenario?
I think it's important for us to bring to the fore that in terms of global religions, there are 2 pockets that bequeathed to humanity the religions of the world, the major religions of the world. It's the Middle East, with your Semitic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. The other pocket is India, that gave to the world Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. And I think the whole concept of ahimsa brought to the fore by Gandhi in modern times is what underpinned Indian philosophy. It's been there since time immemorial, within this Sanatanist tradition, within Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. All of them speak of the oneness of existence, not humanity, of existence. Today we speak of environmental awareness, climate action, and so forth. All of these religions spoke of the coexistence of all forms of life and the equal value of all forms of life. Unity and diversity. And I think this is one of the strengths of India. Because if you look at all of these faiths, the Indic faiths, none of them have gone and dominated other parts of the world by force. Buddhism spread throughout Asia in a very peaceful way. You didn't have Buddhist missionaries going in by force, converting people. Yes, right? Major Hindu empires that went way all over Southeast Asia, remnants of which are seen today, not went and conquered those countries, but took culture, assimilated with the local, and absorbed by the locals. And that is I think, the strength of India. It never was a power to go and dominate others. Even though when you were a major influence in the world, it was not about domination and conquest. It was about enriching and adding to the value of human society by transporting your culture and systems to other parts of the world. And they voluntarily absorbing, and you see the assimilation. I mean, one of the things when I go to Southeast Asia, and perhaps Thailand is a typical example of this, is the perfect blending of Hinduism and Buddhism. Right? Or to go to a place like Vietnam and see them worshipping, or in Japan they're worshipping Lord Ganesha. The whole pantheon of Japanese gods and goddesses are so close to the Hindu pantheon. And this is the beauty of it. And I think this is the strength of India when Prime Minister Modi speaks of Vishwa Guru. It is through this means that we can have the values that underpin the ancient societies reinvigorating modern societies where we have lost our entire ethical, moral value systems, and where conflict is the norm of the day, where abuse of power is the norm of the day, where might is right, and where the weak are relegated to margins of society and the strong do as they wish. But this was never the case. And I think this is why India has such a critical role to play as this new global multipolar paradigm evolves. It must be underpinned by values, ethics, norms